everyone, Ariel Adams here with aBlogtoWatch. This is Superlative Podcast. Please listen to our other podcast, aBlogtoWatch Weekly, where we talk about the latest watch news and reviews. Today in Superlative, my guest is Wei Koh, founder of Revolution Media and the Rake Magazine. Wei, welcome.
Thank you very much, Ariel. How are you?
I'm good. You're one of the people that has been doing this, as long as I have, I think a little bit longer. And I'd like to point out that when we started this, there was no watch podcast, right?
Not at all. I think you're kind of a pioneer in that field, sir.
I was, but I think, thank you for that. But the point I wanted to make is if you wanted to get to know the personality of somebody working in the watch industry, a designer, a watchmaker, an executive, you had to essentially travel probably to Europe, unless you were in a lucky place like Singapore where they would come to visit you. But you'd have to meet them in person. This hobby from a distance was a product-driven hobby. You had no idea what the people were like. You know what I mean?
Well, alternatively, you could do the following. You could go to this thing that was called back in the day a bookshop or a magazine stand, and you'd go and peruse these interesting things of paper that were bound together called magazines or books. And there you would buy your watch periodical. And before I started Revolution, most of those periodicals tended to be a little bit dry, a little bit Germanic, you know?
That's one way of putting it.
Yeah, they were very academic. There's nothing wrong with that. But the idea that I had was, and I was very much inspired by American high school movies, right? So when you go to the cafeteria in the American high school movie, you have the table full of the popular kids, right? That's probably the table you were on, Ariel, right? Then you have the table full of the intellectual but still socially viable kids, right? And then all the way in the back of the cafeteria, you have the table of the social outcasts. And that was the table that I was on, so I knew this very well. And that was the situation with the magazine stand. You would go there and all the cool magazines would be at eye level, right? In the first shelf. And then all the way at the bottom, really tucked somewhere in the recesses, mixed with the hobbyist magazines, cat fancy, model train building, stamp collecting, there you would find the watch titles. And I was like, something's wrong here. So my whole idea was like an American high school movie where you have the makeover to take that social outcast, which was the watch magazine, gussy him up in kind of cool clothes and cool manners and a little bit more social viability, right? And make him the cool guy. So the whole idea for Revolution was without losing the technical credibility, without losing the horological authenticity, to reframe watches so they were the nexus or the crosshairs of contemporary culture, connected to cinema, music, art, literature, everything. And that was Revolution.
Would you believe that I sat at all the tables at one point?
Which one? Okay, then I would like to know what was the key factor that allowed you to go from the table all the way in the back to the table in the front?
See, that presupposes I went in that linear direction.
Oh, really? So you chose it in the opposite way, right?
I jumped around.
You intentionally, okay. Well,
I socially explored. I realized no one clique knew it all, right?
Well, especially today, because what we see is that the people who were on the social outcast table tend to be running the world, basically, right? And so I think that's even reframed the way in which we perceive attractiveness. Obviously, now there's a whole new era where intelligence, sort of like kind of what would almost be on the spectrum in terms of wanting to know everything about a specific subject matter, has now become attractive to us. And at least I like to think so.
So I'm seeing two areas, at least, that we have in common in regard to prior to what we went through before entering the watch industry. One was feeling that the existing watch media was insufficient in one way or another. Both of us probably looked at some of the same titles and been like, oh, at least there's pictures, right? Glad there's a price once in a while. And yes. Second, and I'm guessing, correct me if I'm wrong, we both grew up in a strong magazine culture, where magazines, various types, were a big part of our life, and probably that of our peers as well. Is that right?
I was the guy. So bear in mind that, for example, the biggest fashion issue is the September issue, right? So that comes out basically mid to end of August. And I would be the kid that would be saving up my allowance money or the money I got from odd jobs. And I'd be there the first day the magazines dropped. And I'd buy them all. right? I remember back in the day how transportive great magazines were. So I remember buying everything from Vanity Fair to GQ to The Face to, everything, right? Details magazine. And for like an entire weekend, probably longer, for weeks to come, I would just immerse myself in these worlds. And to me, they were as transportive as cinema was. And I think that's what kind of gave me the motivation to create magazines, right? But yes, I love that culture.
Now, different parts of the world, of course, had different magazines. Most places had enthusiast magazines. For those that don't know, where did you grow up?
I grew up in a small city called New York. I grew up in Manhattan. My dad was working at the United Nations, and so I was born and raised in New York City.
So in America, we had an incredible diversity. I remember sometimes getting jealous because you'd hear about like a cool car magazine or lifestyle magazine they had in Europe, but not in America. And actually, the first time that Revolution came on my radar, I was living in San Francisco at the time, and I don't think it was available yet in America officially. Like, you'd have to get them mailed like one at a time. And I remember certain people who were really excited that Revolution was going to be coming to the United States because, as the name of the magazine implied, and of course there's sort of the double entendre there with watch parts, but it was a very different type of publication. And I remember the first one I saw, it was beautiful. It was a really nice thing. How did you put together such a fantastic set of publications sort of right from the beginning?
Well, thanks, Ariel. It's very kind of you to say. Sometimes I long for the days where you just did everything yourself, right? and it was basically like a garage operation. I didn't even have an office. It was just me, and then I had one dude who helped to sell ads for me because that was the commercial reality of magazines, at least back in the day, and probably still is today. And I did everything. I wrote every single story. In fact, I had to come up with pseudonyms for myself so that it didn't sound like I wrote every story. And one of them, I don't know where I came up with his name, but it was this guy named Declan Quinn, right? And he ended up writing a story that Richard Mille loved called Richard Mille, The Billionaire's Masonic Handshake, which is, at the time, Richard Mille was like just kind of emerging as this cool brand, this kind of secret. And I remember they republished it and printed it and, had little like leaflets made of it and handing it out everywhere. And they were really fascinated by this character, who it was. And I just kept going with this narrative that it was another person. And then one thing that I loved, obviously, was photography. Now, I'm not a photographer, so I, met another guy that was not only an accomplished photographer, but I think more importantly, he was a watch lover. And I'm not joking. We used to, at Basel Fair, go there. We had to stay in Zurich because it was impossible for us to get a hotel room in Basel. We would truck around a medium format camera back in the day, and he would take these glorious images and do between. And then we had a, freelance designer, freelance editor, and put that magazine together ourselves. And that was it.
Now, again, thank you for sharing the humble origin story, but that was a very polished publication. And of course, there was a lot of competition in the space. What special talents did you have or access that allowed you to have, was it just, it was more than just photography. There was layouts, there was the paper and stuff like that. You obviously knew magazines, you knew what you wanted. That was obvious, but that was, as you know, it's always complicated. You don't just come out with a great watch right away. It takes a few models. But maybe I didn't see the first few issues, but by the time I saw it, which was early on, you had already looked better than every other print publication about watches on the market that I'd ever seen.
Well, thanks, man. So obviously I love magazines, and I kind of digested them voraciously for the better part of 2 decades. And also I went to film school, so I used to live in your hometown in Los Angeles and worked briefly in the film industry. And so I love storytelling. I think that was really important to me. Also, I was fortunate that my brother worked in publishing as well. And so I worked for him for a bit as well. And I just, I was very frustrated as a freelance writer, or even when I was the guy that used to be in charge of putting watch supplements together, that publishing houses invariably applied the following metric: let's get as much advertising revenue as we can while spending as little money on quality as we could. And I wanted to create something that just exuded quality, that was, large format, that was thick in paper, that had really dense articles, but actually showed you every significant part of the watch. And then there's one other factor, which was it was intentionally provocative, right? So which is not something that I would do today, but in the context of 2005, I put like a very beautiful woman, right? But then wearing a very technical watch along a double split on the cover. And it made you just kind of stop and be like, what the hell is that? And then you'd pick it up and then you'd start to flip through it and you're like, oh, I really like this magazine, right? And so it wasn't like a trick or anything. It wasn't like a kind of P.T. Barnum active like self-promotion. It was just like I thought it'd be really cool to just merge these worlds and create something that was very unexpected.
I mean, it made a lot of sense. I mean, it was an old maxim in all media that sex sells. I grew up with magazines like Maxim, for example. I don't know if that's still around. That was... I don't want to call it Playboy light, but it was suggestive, but in a tasteful, good way. It was interesting to a large cross-section of men. And it was a good way to be like, you come for the girl, but you stay for the watch. And that's totally okay, because the hobby itself, unless you already are infatuated with the look of machines, is quite obtuse and weird unless you have some context. And so saying, this person is beautiful, this object is beautiful, the industry itself often was not even able to do that, right?
I think that's something that persists to this day, right? So I think the biggest challenge for the watch industry is it's almost trying to attract the watch adjacent audience, right? Because the people that it speaks to, of course, they have a connection with them. But if you look at it, like the biggest watch brand in the world, Rolex, its turnover is just over 10 billion Swiss francs, right? If you compare that to Mercedes-Benz, for example, that's like 13 times smaller than Mercedes. You know what I mean? And there's no person that I know that buys a Mercedes because they need it for pragmatic transport. They buy it because that car gives them emotion. It's the same thing. And even worse, probably that Mercedes is not going to endure forever. It's probably going to endure 10 years if you're lucky. Whereas a watch endures forever. So I think the watch industry is always trying to figure out, how do we reach a broader audience? How do we continue to grow this audience? Why are we so insular in our own way? And how do we, in particular, connect with the next generation? If you look at how that's been done, it's been, done in many different ways, right? So when I did it with Revolution, it was to create a provocation, but it had to be balanced by quality and it had to be balanced by knowledge. Then you have today, for example, the rise of all the YouTube influencers or the TikTokers and so on. And it's the same thing. People are trying to figure out, how do I broaden that audience? But, Ariel, you and I have been around for a long time. We've seen the rise of social media. We've seen the rise of forums. We've seen the rise of online. We've seen everything kind of come, and many of them also go, right? And I would say the one thing that allows you to remain relevant, the one thing that creates endurance for you or perenniality for you, is first of all genuine passion for the subject matter, because you can't really talk about watches well if you don't love it. And the second thing, and I see this in particular, it's quality, right? So recently Rolex, there's a kind of debate as to whether they leaked their own land dweller video or land dweller images.
Right,
2 days before Basel Fair, 2 days before Watches and Wonders. It shows you how old I am, right? They leaked a video they dropped a video of the land dweller. And in that video, if you really like watches and are crazy about watches, you can tell everything about that watch. You can tell the type of escapement it has. You can tell the material that it's being made from, so on and so forth. And so we did a video like, hey, here's everything you need to know. And we got most of it right. Integrated bracelet model based on the oyster quartz. It's a hybrid escapement that's part natural escapement and it's double wheel, but it's still got a rocker mechanism, kind of like V2 of Ulysse Nardin's escapement for the Freak. It's made of silicon. It's got a Siloxy hairspring. It's high frequency. We got that too. The only thing we got wrong was I thought it would be totally non-lubricated, because what a statement. But it already is an incredible statement. And the thing is, unless you love watches and are fascinated by them and genuinely and earnestly learn as much as you can about them, you're not really a watch journalist, right? And I know it's a provocative thing to say about it, but it's true, And you see so many people today driving their brands or channels or whatever forward using just opinion. They're a dynamic personality. They're an interesting person. They have an amusing way of framing knowledge. But unless you go into the craft of watchmaking and have some depth to it, it's hard to remain. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I think, you said it yourself, quality rises to the top eventually. The internet has been exploring what media is for the last 25 years or so, and we've sort of been right there in it. I see new things come and go. I see new personalities come and go. And what I ultimately realize is that if you are a consumer and you've spent more than 3 or 4 years in this hobby, you very quickly recognize who has value to listen to and who is just a whole lot of hot air and emotion. And I think that becomes quite apparent very, very fast because, like a difficult exam, you can't really BS your way through this hobby, right?
Absolutely. That's actually kind of what I love about it is that the watch industry, and by virtue of that watch media, it's super democratic. You can be anyone, right, from any walk of life, but as long as you put in the time and really learn, and really voice that knowledge, framed with some imagination, some opinion, and some storytelling, then you'll rise. I mean, I'll give you a couple of examples, like Tim Mosso, I think is great, and he's, an eccentric kind of dude, with the Oakleys and everything, but he's awesome, right? He's an amazing storyteller and he has so much depth. And then Tony Trimna as well, I love him too. And he's also a guy that has so much knowledge and has so much curiosity and wants to go to the next level. And then even someone who you may not think that I'm a huge fan of, Roman Sharf. Right? Like Roman, I think, is an incredible guy because he comes from the world of being a secondary dealer. I think he made it, watches really interesting because you got to follow him making these $1 million deals. And, he kind of introduced the word mazal to everyone's vocabulary. But underlying all of this is an immense love for watches and a really sincere desire to express everything that's beautiful about them. And he's very knowledgeable as well. So you can be
all three of those guys have been on the show.
That's awesome. Yeah. And same thing with you, Ariel. Remember you're a veteran, but I remember when you first burst onto the scene as well, you were different. You weren't you're completely different. You were American, relaxed, but very intense, but when you looked at the pages that you put together, there was great substance there, right?
Yeah. So I look, I hear from a lot of our colleagues the frustration of competition. I get it. New things, the brands are always looking for what's next. They try to flirt with everything that's has potential. They're very keen on trying to get more value for less money, and they're willing to experiment with a lot of low quality stuff. It's kind of surprising. But then again, it's like if we sit around and we just sort of have confidence, they'll come crawling back. They just they always do, right? Every single time they're like, "Oh, Ariel, we tried, but no good.
I wouldn't say crawling, but I agree with you completely that quality.
It'd be great if they crawled, right? Tough. I could fantasize, right? Well,
absolutely.
Look, you and I and a small number of others have assisted this industry to reach new levels in terms of awareness, perception, personality, especially storytelling. I mean, they're so bad at telling their own stories. That's good for us, bad for them, but it means that you need a whole ecosystem to get this industry right. And so at the end of the day, we continue to help them sell a lot of watches. We continue to make this a hobby that a large number of men and women around the world want to spend their money on, and they need that. And so they know they need media. They're not really good at determining what media they need, but they know that without media, they're gone, right? Just like without retailers, they're gone.
I totally agree with you, first of all. And second of all, I think that sometimes people feel like, I'm taking advertising money to talk about something. There's something shameful in that. Quite the opposite, right? I actually feel that what we do is a very meaningful contribution to this entire ecosystem.
What's shameful is lying and begging. Lying and begging is shameful. If you do either of those things, shame on you. Everything else, there's no shame.
Absolutely. It's funny because Roman and I were having this conversation in Watches and Wonders, and we both have the same philosophy where if I'm not going to talk about it, it's probably because I don't like it, right? I'm not going to go on camera and say this is terrible or whatever, because again, watches are purely emotional. Maybe I don't like it, but maybe you do. But that's my perspective on things. I also will say that over the course of the last couple of years, maybe I've championed too many things, right? Part of that is because I feel that like when times are a bit tough, I think that it's really important to show up for the industry and try to kickstart it again, motivate it again, make it feel like there's an infrastructure and a support system for it, even in the media. But also sometimes I feel like, every time there's someone that comes up to me and you micro brand with my natural inclination is to try to be helpful because I like to think I'm a helpful person. But sometimes I realize that it's important to also be more selective about what you support. And so this is a year where I'm trying to be very focused on supporting things that I truly believe in.
I thank you for pointing that out. Correct me if I'm wrong. Part of that is you're good to them because you want them to be good back to you, right? That's just sort of relationship building 101. How often do you find they return in kind?
Well, let me put it to you this way, right? Like I was a little frustrated last year. So I usually have this fondue party, right, in the end of Watches and Wonders. I didn't have it this year for a couple of reasons. One is that I foresaw myself just being really exhausted because it was going to be such an intense fair. The second thing is I'm trying not to drink, right, and I spent so much of my life being the guy that loves to have a drink because that's the culture we grew up in, right, and watch journalism in particular. It was always like, oh, it was work hard, play hard. You're not really a cool journalist if you're not at the after party with a drink in your hand. And as someone who is newly married, as someone who's trying to become a father, I want to be present in the life that I have now because I love my life so much. I'm so grateful to be married to an extraordinary woman. And I don't want to be that drunk guy anymore, right? So it's just not interesting to me. For the second of all,
I have the reputation for not drinking because I don't drink. It's hard. People really pressure you. They make you feel bad. I mean, you're absolutely right that there's a lot of peer pressure.
Well, and let's maybe stop here or pause here on the other stuff and just talk about that, right? It's when I look back at my life, right, and I look at anything that may have possibly gone wrong, a lot of times it was just because I was drunk, right? And maybe I said the wrong thing or, reacted too forcefully to something. And if you know that, then why would you, consciously repeat that over and over again, first of all? Second of all, I went through a period of my life where I think a lot of my friends know that I wasn't really happy in my personal life, right? And so by being drunk all the time, then you kind of are able to create this kind of falsehood. Yeah, it's an escape that, everything's fine, you're laughing a lot, everything, it's cool. But it wasn't cool. And sometimes I have concerns that when I see people who have that capacity to binge drink that are just really going for it, there's some underlying issue there that's making them unhappy. And they just don't want to confront that. And that's their escape, as you say, right?
Well, I mean, there needs to be more context here because, and thank you for that story. I'm proud of you. And that's great that you've come to that realization. It's healthy. But this is a special circumstance because this industry, I mean, I remember when I first started, I was 25. You're also very young when you started. It's like a game. It's like, can you avoid being screwed up at these events where it's just, it's constant food, alcohol over and over and over. It's not like you were going and looking for drinks. Like you actively had to say no. It was like incoming missiles all over the place. You have to fend off and you need some type of strategy for not looking like you're the unfun guy. Like what you're saying is totally applicable to a lot, but if you're in the watch industry, you're around it all the time. It is
totally.
I joke like LVMH, it's like they're trying to get rid of champagne. They're like, we got too much. Please help us get rid of it more. Take a bottle, take two.
Well, I was trying to figure out why it is that alcohol is so associated with the watch industry, right? Because you're absolutely right.
Because you make dumb purchases when you're drunk.
Well, no, I think it's more than that, right? So, okay, let's go back to why it is that watch brands, or let's just say the watch in general, is doesn't have so much aptitude for marketing itself, right? So the watch industry, if you go back hundreds of years ago, was created by the Huguenots, right, or Huguenots. And these are the guys in France that were the Protestants. And they were being kind of constantly victimized by the Catholic Church. And so eventually there was this edict called the Edict of Fontainebleau, which meant that, like, listen, it's actually completely legal for you to go and kill Protestants in the streets if you want to. And this created a mass exodus from France. The Huguenots, like, finally had enough. They kind of said, okay, then, fuck this, dude, we're out. They marched over the Alps en masse to show you what badasses they were, right? They're such resilient people. And they ended up in Switzerland, and they ended up settling in the parts of Switzerland that no one else wanted to be in, right? The most
high up and cold.
Right, exactly. High up and freezing, right? And then they were like, okay, we're going to farm when it's warm, but in the wintertime, which is pretty much 8 months out of the year, what are we going to do? So this is the thing that I always find kind of funny because, and this was even like, I don't know if you listened to the Acquired podcast on Rolex. They're like, and then this cottage industry just sprung up called watchmaking, right? I'm like, no, dude, it doesn't come. I mean, look, Ariel, if you put me and the two of us in a shack in the winter, are we going to come up with how to make watch parts? Obviously not, right? Because we don't know how to do that. The Huguenots were the workforce of the French watch industry, right? And that's how they knew how to make watch parts. So if you may remember, it was actually France that was the epicenter of watchmaking. That's why Breguet in the 1800s was all over, in the late 1700s and the early 1800s was based in Paris because it was the epicenter of watchmaking, despite the fact that he was Swiss. So these guys all knew how to do that, and they collectively rose up and created this cottage industry and eventually the Swiss watch industry, and were so successful at it that they completely almost eradicated the France from, like, the history books of being the most incredible watchmakers. And probably there was some intentionality towards that as well, because don't forget, those guys expelled us from France, right? So anyway, why are they bad at marketing? So I don't know if you've ever been to the cathedral in Geneva, right? But this is where John Calvin used to, give his speeches and so on. It was the hotbed and epicenter of Calvinism and Protestantism. If you go in, there's no paintings, right? You're meant to intentionally dress in very somber colors. You cannot show an overt expression of happiness or joy. There was not even jewelry permitted, which is why watches became a thing as well. And there's no choir. You're not allowed to express yourself. So let's think about who are the greatest marketeers in the world. I would say probably the Italians, right? Look, it's a Ferrari, you know what I mean? Or it's like, and the Italians and the French also. I mean, you mentioned LVMH Group, but the French in general. I mean, if you think about the greatest fashion brands in the world, they're probably the French, like Dior, or Italian, like, Armani or Dolce & Gabbana or what have you. These are Catholic brands, right? Because they understand pomp. They understand choirs. They understand every single great artwork until probably Impressionism was created for the church, right? I mean, think about every masterpiece. It was for a painter that was painting essentially for the church. So the Catholics are amazing at marketing, and the Calvinists are terrible at marketing because they've been told not to market, right? So when is the moment that they can kind of cut loose and where they can really kind of like be relaxed and be themselves? It's when they have a couple of drinks, right? And so that's, to me, like, if you ever go to Fleurier or the Vallée du Joux, people are very reserved initially until you go have a fondue with them, and then you have like 1, 2, 3 bottles of fondant or Petit Alvin, and then you have the kirsch at the end, and everyone's having a great time. It's almost like they cannot be overtly expressive unless they're cutting loose in this way. And I think that this is part of the culture of Swiss watchmaking. But I also agree with you. It shouldn't make you feel like you don't have a part in it if you're not also getting blasted like everyone else, because there's, at least for me, there's no real future in that for me, right?
Well, I think that's cool that you asked yourself, why do these people drinking in the first place? That's a good question to ask. And I've pondered similarly nuanced issues that probably go back hundreds of years, the answers and explanations. But, what is going to be the healthy alternative to drinking? Because they still need that celebratory environment. Is there an alternative? That's
a really, really tough one, right? I think that it's kind of a conversation that we as a race, like the human race, is thinking about as well, because pretty much every smart person that I know has basically stopped drinking, right? And especially, you were smart to do it in your 20s. It took me a lot longer, obviously. I'm in my mid-50s now. But now that I have the most amazing life in the world, now that we're going to be starting a family in my mid-50s, I want the next, decades of my life to be ones where I can be present and I can have a high quality of life. And alcohol is just going to be one of the greatest deterrents that I can imagine. All these new studies are coming out on how bad it is, but it's just in terms of even my behavior, right? Like I want to be myself. I want to be present, conscious, right? Like I want to wake up every morning and have a super clear head. I'm not saying I'll never have a drink. Maybe, maybe every once in a while, there's some great celebration for a really sincere moment. And yeah, I'll have a glass of champagne with you, but I'm not, I used to drink 4 or 5, some 6 times a week, like it just becomes like a trap, right? You drink and then you feel like crap in the morning, and then maybe you work out and you feel better by midday, and by the afternoon you're like, I'm going to have just 1 beer, and the next thing you know, you're blasted again, right? And that's not a way to live your life, at least not for me.
I had an inadvertent advantage at many of these shows because I wasn't drinking at night and I was like working, and don't get me wrong, I wasn't getting a ton of sleep, but I wasn't hungover, and I'd progressively see, like, as the days go on, fellow media just like dragging their feet, and I'm like, I still got it. And it's like all because nothing that different, I just wasn't drinking. That was really the only difference. So it's funny that people are like, oh yeah, that was really holding us back a little bit.
Yeah, it's funny also because I remember Basel Ferry, right, back in the day. I'm sure you do as well. And every journalist has made that rookie mistake of just going out too hard, right? And the brands like encourage it. They're like, they have these late dinners and then they have after parties. And if you actually go to those dinners and you attend those after parties and you drink consistently and then end up in Bar Rouge or one of the Aqua, I think was the nightclub in Basel, you're going to be destroyed, right? You're not going to be able to function at all for the remainder of the week. And it's like, why did you even go there if you're not going to be your best? And that's kind of like, an example to me also of just life in general, right? Like, why do you not want to have 100% of your own ability at your disposal at all times? And if you know that that's something that's holding you back, then just don't do it, man. So, anyway.
Here's the hard question. This is the hard question. My background's entertainment law, and part of that is study the life trajectory of entertainers, especially musicians. And as we know, let's look at the rock star life trajectory, right? At some point, if they don't die, they go clean. They're like, whoa, what was I doing, right? But then their performance, while maybe not bad, doesn't have the energy, doesn't have the creativity. So the real question for me is, how do you bring all that good stuff to the table, all that, unpredictability, all that big thinking, all that risk taking, when you are of a level mindset, right? Because that's the issue. Our jobs still demand that we entertain, that we see the story, that we're there, that we think of creative ways of telling these people sometimes super boring lives and manufacturing processes. Unless we bring I'll call it gonzo journalism element to the table, they're not going to give it to us. So similarly to the rock stars who have the same question, how do you still have your mojo? How do you still have that charisma and that attractiveness to audiences if you are not actually having as much fun?
It's funny you mentioned that because I probably have enjoyed my conversations more like when I'm not drinking,
Okay.
I used to always think I was having such a great time, but now I actually listen to people, right? You're not just kind of like thinking of the next funny thing to say or interrupting people or whatever. You're actually listening to people. So, and if you make the effort to just immerse yourself in the conversation and be genuinely curious, you're not necessarily going to be that first guy that goes home, right? You don't want to be that, party pooper or whatever like that. I totally get that. But if you're having a good time, if you're generally having a good conversation, that itself should be the enjoyment itself. And the other thing too is it gives you so many more hours in the day to be creative as well, right? So it gives you the opportunity to really kind of do cool shit, So for example, and this is by no means finished yet, but I should probably not even mention it because I'm always of the belief that you should do it first and and then talk about it afterwards. But I'm working on the first episodic television series on the watch industry. And to run the magazine, to do the content that's required for that, and then try to work on this at the same time, you really have to be, on point all the time, because you want to give your best energy into everything. You don't want to feel like, oh, that article I wrote was a bit shitty because I was tired, or, I just kind of winged it through that video or interview with a CEO. But at the same time, when I'm sitting in front of the computer, kind of coming up with storylines for each of these episodes, like I really want to feel, and I think that at the end of the day, if you're putting positive, like creative energy into everything, you're kind of like, it's like a high, right? And then there's one other thing that I would say, well, two other things. One is I love to exercise. I always did. And I know you ride your bike a lot, but I probably do it a lot more now that I can kind of just focus on doing that. And I can wake up early in the morning and get my runs in and so on. And then just being with the right person. Right. It sounds really cliched and corny, whatever, but just being with someone who is making you laugh all the time and that you have such amazing conversations with, that's like the greatest high ever. And so I really have to say once again, it's going to be a podcast about me thanking my wife, but my gratitude to my wife is extraordinary in this regard. I'm
sure she'll appreciate that. Women like that sort of thing.
Sorry, but back to where I was talking about related to the fondue party. I made this effort to really kind of be nice to and uplift a lot of the micro brands. I did a bunch of symposiums on them during the last Geneva Watch Days, and then of course I invited a couple of them to the fondue, and I just got overrun, right? And I remember like they came, and I don't get too upset at it because I know they're kind of young and, they're just enthusiastic, but I would invite one guy and he'd bring 5 friends and it'd just be chaotic in there. And then the people that I genuinely invited wouldn't have seats. Right. And it just became like, and then I try to like explain that to them, but they'd be, drunk by that point. So back to our conversation, there's no real talking to them. And so I kind of think about it from this, what you were saying about this, the industry give back to you. It does, but you also have to make a point not to let yourself be taken advantage of, right? And I think that you and I both understand that pretty well. Like if you look at this whole ecosystem of the watch industry, and I'm very, very happy and thankful to be where I am as a creator of media, but we are the ones that actually may positively impact the industry a lot, but actually the tangible benefits we get from that is actually very low in comparison to the turnover of a watch brand or certainly a distributor or a retailer. Media is the one that is impacted the least commercially, right? And so I sometimes think that, and I say this with incredible gratitude for the beautiful trips we've been taking on, and as you say, the overflowing amounts of champagne that we're being offered as well. But don't forget, it's a bit of a trick, right? It's kind of like, I'm going to fly you in a certain part of the plane that you can't normally afford. I certainly can't, right? I'm going to put you in a hotel you normally would not be able to stay in. I wouldn't be able to. I'm going to give you a meal that's going to be a meal that, you would only dream of having. And you're going to be so overwhelmed by this, this treatment that you're going to feel like, okay, what can I do to make you happy, right? I feel that's first of all, I'm super grateful for those opportunities or whatever, but it's kind of like if you like what I do, if you feel that what I create has merit, it should be recognized based on that. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? We are running businesses after all. So that's cool, but you don't have to fly me in that plane. You don't have to even bring me on that trip, but let's talk about a real partnership, because what I don't like is the fact that it can be very, it can be very like, oh, when I need you, I really need you. But then when I'm feeling confident, no, I've forgotten about you, right? So I'm fortunate enough to have been around long enough to have really deep relationships with so many of these people that I love in the industry that in general, our relationships really endure, right? But I'll give you an example. There's one brand, which I won't name, right, who sat me down at lunch and was like, hey, Wei, our name is so popular now that we don't have to do any traditional media partnerships anymore, right?
I've heard this before.
we have to be written about by you, because if you don't write about us,
it's your obligation now. People expect it.
No, it's not even your obligation. It's bad for your search algorithm because that's how big we are, right? Like you're not going to have as much traffic as everyone else if you don't write about us. So I'm sorry, but our belief is to no longer invest in traditional media. And you just need to write about us because we're so important and popular now. And I was like, wow, that's incredibly arrogant. Now, I'll use in comparison the conversations I have or the relationship I have with some of the probably the biggest brands in the industry, it's always consistent. Good times, bad times, it's consistent because that's a real partnership, right? But when times are tough, I'm still there for you. When times are great, I haven't forgotten that we have a relationship. And because of that, I try to always over-deliver for that. And also, I genuinely love those guys as well. Like, I love what they create. I believe they are truly extraordinary. So it's funny to me that you would have a guy who, a few years ago was like, oh, let's do whatever partnership is. We have to, we're friends and we're going to rise up. And we're just now like, bro, I don't need you. Right. And I'm sorry, it's just not my philosophy. I feel as if your business has no real meaning. And I'm like, whoa, okay.
So let me, again, I totally agree with you. I've had the exact same circumstances. I have tried to depersonalize it over the years by asking myself, like, culturally, what the mechanisms are going on here. And again, I'm not trying to overgeneralize, but one thing I've noticed, which is the difference between European business mentality, not universally, but just in general, oftentimes very, very Swiss, and actually America, and I think a lot of Asian countries have in common. In America and a lot of Asian countries, there's this idea of let's make money together. Like, if I'm making money, you're making money, otherwise this doesn't work out. In Switzerland, it's not that. There isn't anything we're doing together. It's you come and you bring your money here and we'll do some service for you. So money goes in and some output comes out, something. Money never comes out, right? They don't want it to go out. So it's like a black hole of cash.
I will respectfully disagree with you in this regard because I feel as if you're absolutely right. There are two types of people in this world. And I feel as if
I'm being very black and white on purpose,
Yes, yeah, I know. But I would say that I definitely have relationships, friends, business partners that I work with in the way where it's like, let's work together and let's always figure out a way to work together. Oftentimes I would say it's not down to the culture of the individual country, but the culture of the individual person that's leading that brand, right? Or who's in the key position of that brand. And I've always felt as if the people who understand the long term and who are building for perenniality always want to have like partnerships that are long term. It's funny because that the market is really like upside down right now. It's been a super bumpy last year. Everyone's imagining it's going to be a bumpy, polarizing year this year as well. Now we've got the tariff situation as well, which is no one has real foresight as to what's going to be the outcome. And yet in the beginning of this year, we've had the most partnerships we've had in a long time, right? And I think that a lot of that is also because over the last couple of years, we've just tried to reinforce excellence, right? Maybe we didn't have that medium. So like I would say before COVID, we weren't as big in video as we are now. And now we have it. We've got like 186,000 YouTube subscribers. And because we're able to translate the excellence we had in print also into video, people are like, that's what we need, right? And so we're good in that regard. But I feel, again, like you say, right, it's like we do I hope what is genuinely a good service, right? Like an ethical service, right? Like I wouldn't want to be in this business if for whatever reason I felt there were no underlying ethics to it. I genuinely think we work hard, we do a good job, we uplift something that deserves to be uplift. And then, of course, there should be, a positive remunerative benefit from that because we're not communists, right? So
I think what's important is that you have successfully always strived to give, we'll call it clients, what they want. You identify what they want, you try to give them what they want and exceed their expectations. The problem is, in a lot of instances, watch industry clients don't actually know what they want. They know what their ultimate goals are, like we want money and success, but they don't know really what they want you to do, and they expect to like hire a plumber to build a house. But we're like, yeah. I'm just a plumber. You need other people for that. No. If you're a good plumber, you can always build a house for the same price, right? And that type of mentality, I think, is what goes against us, because their expectations are unreasonable. Therefore, we don't actually know how they gauge success, because they always ask for more than anyone can deliver.
Well, I mean, I think the clear thing to me, at least, is a great leader in this industry has to be super connected to watches themselves, right? And you see a lot of instances where they try to parachute in, managers that come from multinationals or different parts of the business infrastructure. And somehow, to me, it doesn't really work, right? Like, if you think about who's a truly great leader in this industry, right? These are guys that like live and breathe and are obsessed by their own watches, and that's so important, right? So I know that a lot of times people don't know what they want, but I feel it's kind of that person that came in from an industry and hasn't made the effort to learn it, right? So if you look at, like, let's take an easy example, Jean-Fred Dufour, right? Like, Rolex is absolutely screaming right now. The creation of the Land Dwellers, almost like something no one ever thought they would, like Rolex would do. All new escapement, first time in Switzerland since 1999. Silicone, which incidentally Rolex was the first one to experiment in. But he's a watch guy through and through. Don't forget, he was the guy that was helping Chopard create all the LUC movements. He's so interested in watches. Then let's take another example, Jean Arnault, right? Like, here's a guy that, like, you're like, okay, how is this person who's from this incredibly aristocratic French family, very wealthy family, obviously, as well, how's this one individual going to come in and shape so much change in Vuitton watches?
He's done a good job. He's done a great job.
But it's also because he loves it. Like, he's obsessed by watches. Like, you can have a conversation with him and he knows everything about watches. Then there's people who are running very big brands where it's clear that they don't know anything about watches, right? So the problem, therefore, is that they have to use that whole thing, well, okay, let's get a team together and everyone figure out what should we be making? Okay, what's the right price category? What's working in the rest of the industry? Well, let's make one of those. Bro, that's never going to work, right? Nothing great can be created by committing in this industry. The only thing that works in this industry is when one or maybe a small group of individuals love something and they want to see it happen, right? And they are even pushing for it, even if people are like, dude, you're crazy, it's never going to work. Richard Mille is an example of that. Frank Mueller is an example of that. AP and the Royal Oak is an example of that, right? Like, everything great, Lange and Gunther Blumlein, the incredible Gunther Blumlein is an example of that. Nothing great in this industry can be accomplished by a professional doing market surveys. It's just not going to work. So those are the guys that don't know what they want.
Let me take it a step further. I agree with you, but I would up the ante one step. Oftentimes, the manager is a function of what I'll call the money. And I think the problem has been the monetary interest. There has been brand ownership who expects the brand to offer them a regular monetary return. I am trying to shift the concept of the financing overall such that people recognize these as basically vanity brands. You make your money somewhere else. Other than spending it on taxes and boring stuff, you have this brand where you can have beautiful products, beautiful parties, create something interesting, not a bunch of boring stuff. This is sort of like at the top of a ladder of a bunch of other stuff you do. You're otherwise independently have money. I'm trying to change the return expectation and recognize that these brands all require essentially infinite investment, as much as you can handle, and all the money it makes needs to be reinvested again. And I think that's the paradigm that needs to change, because once you have that type of money, it then naturally flows that the leadership is going to take those risks and stop asking themselves, oh my God, how do I make a return next quarter? How do I keep my job a year from now and show that I've made some performance success? Like, for me, that's the underlying problem. And I actually think it's not unreasonable, given this category, given that there isn't a lot of competition out there, to say that these businesses don't necessarily need to earn third-party shareholders or regular return.
Okay, I'm going to take a slightly different perspective on this. I think that what people forget sometimes is that in order to be successful in this industry, you can't just be a great watchmaker or a great creator of watches. You have to be immensely immersed in that culture. You have to be a genius in terms of design and movement construction, or at least have a broad framework of how that works and how you want it to. And then on top of that, you have to be a brilliant businessman, right? Now, the problem is a lot of creative people are incredibly bad businessmen, right? There's like, independent watchmakers that have been around for ages that are still to this day struggling to, pay their rent or, pay their salaries. Or
and
keep
that's
the
to be
lights on.
expected. It goes with the territory.
Right. Well, yes and no, right? Like I used to find that admirable until I actually spent some time with one of these guys. And I'm like, dude, what do you spend your money on? And I realized he's not that he's poor. He's just really undisciplined in terms of how he spends his money. Right? He's just buying stupid shit all the time, basically. He's like a child, right? I'm like, you bought how many tower clocks and you bought what? Something else for this hobby of yours? And you bought a piece of I'm like, bro, you haven't paid your rent, right? Like, is that, and it's almost as if like there's an excuse because I'm a creative genius. It's like, actually, that's not really an excuse. Okay, so let's take some positive examples, right? Let's look at the two independent watch brands that have the highest revenue, right? So one is François-Paul Journe, right? And the second one is Moser. Okay, so let's look at these. François-Paul Journe to me is probably the GOAT. And I think I would say he may have even eclipsed Abraham Louis Breguet at this point for the fact that he is a genius watchmaker who's been able to put his core creations into understandable, relatable models, create a legacy for himself, and then also be a brilliant businessman underlying that, right? So he owns his own manufacturer. He owns his own dial factory. He owns his own case factory. And he owns his entire retail network as well, right? And from what I understand, the only influx of capital he's ever had was the 20%, I think, that Chanel purchased from him back in the day. And the rest is all self-financed. That's incredible, right? And this guy also, he's making close to 100 million Swiss francs a year. And he has a production. Okay, this is if you go based on the Morgan Stanley report, which of course no one actually knows how accurate this is. But his growth has also been because he's producing a quartz watch that everyone has lost their mind about, which is the Elegant as well, which is active genius, right? Don't forget that back in the day, Patek's growth was fueled by the 24, which was their quartz watch as well. Then the second one for that is Moser, right? Moser, I think, is at like 93, 95 million Swiss francs turnover. And these guys are absolute animals, right? The Meylan brothers are like just constantly working, going for it, relentless, right? And it's a pretty high volume brand. I think that's like 3,000 watches or whatever. So that's a lot of like independent watches to put out into the market. Then you go to Schaffhausen and you realize that they own most of their own manufacturing as well. So they're getting a pretty significant margin on that stuff because nothing's really outsourced, and that's really impressive. And then the way they've globalized that brand, the way they've made guerrilla marketing their own thing as well, right? Like, and fundamentally, don't forget that Edward Meylan went to Wharton Business School, right? So like these are guys that really understand business, but are also great, creators of compelling watches, and that's kind of what it takes to be a freaking badass in this world, And yes, I would imagine, from what I understand, if you look at the 93 or 95 billion Swiss francs turnover of Moser, the EBITDA, from what I understand, because it's not public, is very impressive, right? And it goes to show you actually that the watch industry can be extremely profitable because of what? Because it's actually a very high margin industry. If you look at it in comparison to cars, for example, whatever, right? The margins in cars, from what I understand, are very, very small. Like, and if there's anything that goes wrong in the supply chain, right, you're basically screwed. If a guy doesn't deliver doors to you on the right day, you've destroyed the entire, potential profitability of those cars. Whereas the watch industry has the most undisciplined supply chain, right? It's nothing's ever on time, which is something I've learned. But it's
always very expensive.
And always very expensive. And it's able to absorb that because of the incredible margins that it has. Incidentally, I don't know if you've ever gone to any of these factories, these case factories or, dial factories or any of these suppliers. They're awesome. Dude, not only awesome, go look at the cars that are in the parking lot, right?
I know what you're talking about. Their keychain full of like Ferrari, 5 supercar keys at one time.
Dude, and if you want to know like who's making the most money in the watch industry, from what I understand, the suppliers are absolutely.
You're absolutely right. That's why these guys own their own suppliers, because like I don't want to keep paying these guys insane salaries and waiting for parts whenever they feel like sending them. I can't handle that.
So back to my thing is you should be able to make money in the watch industry, right? But the only problem
But that shouldn't be your goal.
No, because you'll never be able to be good if you're, it's kind of like if you try to make a movie that's like, hey, I want to make a movie that's going to be win the Academy Award, you're never going to be successful, right? Because you just have to love what you do, and hopefully that passion creates a product that is really compelling to other people. So I agree.
I want to spend our remaining minutes talking about an interesting transition in your career, which was going from being media guy to being media guy. And there's different hats you wear. You sell watches. You also create watches. You create some other products. It's not entirely out of the wheelhouse, so it's not like this giant leap, but it's an emotional difference. It's obviously a business difference. Tell me a little bit about what you initially went through emotionally when you recognized, I'm going to be doing a little bit more than just being a media professional.
Well, I mean, it also became like, the more you grow, like the irony is the more you grow, it's not necessarily you make more money, right? You just have like a lot more
headaches you have.
You certainly have a lot more people management problems, right? So of course we wanted to have a certain size of business. We wanted to have a certain, internationalism in terms of the territories that we covered. But at least to a certain extent, I think that media partnerships they're limited to some degree, right? You know what I mean? And it's not something where you can like kind of turn on and like the gas and like turbocharge it and be like, okay, now I want to increase it by this much. It really is dependent on just going out there and creating value for people. So then it's like, what else could you do, which is something that you love, hopefully, and that's related to the business that you have. Then the whole idea of creating limited edition watches came about. I guess pretty early on, all the way back in 2018 when we had our first collaboration with Tag Heuer. Although we had done before that a Panerai, we'd done an IWC, we'd even done an AP. But back in those days, the brands would never accept that you would sell the watches, right? So they would sell the watches. So in 2018 was the first watch that we actually sold directly on our own channels. And I guess one thing that people immediately asked was, well, how are you going to be objective if you're selling watches now? And my point is, like, I don't think we've ever really been objective, right? Like, I'm not sure there's objectivity to begin with in something that's based on emotion, but I've always been extremely passionate about the stuff that I love. And kind of dispassionate or
objectivity has never been my goal. It's just transparency.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think when you were like really clear, like, hey, listen, I created this watch because I genuinely love it, and it's something that I think that I would love to have. And I do own a lot of those watches until I couldn't afford buying all the editions that we're coming out with. It was watches that were created that, like, what could I have? If I was given the incredible opportunity to co-design a watch with Tag Heuer, or more recently to have a watch created in collaboration with Naoya Hida, what would I want, And it just became a byproduct of that. Has that been a decent business? Yeah, it's been a decent business, but it's not without its learning curve as well, right? It's funny because you can only learn through experience. So, we walked into this relatively naively, and when you are a little too naive about it, you kind of get taken advantage of a little bit, right? Because what's the greatest thing that we have, Ariel, you and I, right? It's the communication. Right? It's the storytelling. It's the media, basically. And when brands see you coming and they're like, ooh, you're going to pay for our watches and we get free media? Sure, maybe we'll do that, right? Can we get a little extra media on this? And then sometimes you do collaborations with brands where, there's an expectation that you're always going to consistently support them on everything that they do. And it's like, okay, so there has to be a learning curve there as well. And there has to be some balance for that as well. But has that brought another dimension to our business? Yeah, I would say so. I think the best thing about that business actually is that I started to meet watch collectors much more for the first time, because as a media person, you kind of mix with them. And of course, if that's your social community, you get to meet them as well. But to actually meet people and to pass them a watch that, you'd co-design, and you see that it actually makes them happy. I mean, that's super meaningful, right? So, but it's been a fun adventure, and we're going to be doing more of that, I guess, It's
an interesting thing. Next time we chat, I want to explore that deeper, because I've been, I guess, intentionally and pragmatically not much of a designer because I don't want to do most of the things the brands want me to do. So I've waited until there's the right opportunity. And I've had a few cool things, and there's always some things in the mix, but I'm in no rush. For me, if it's not a project that makes sense for me, I don't want to do it. I leave that to other people. The last thing I want to talk about, and this goes back to some of the early issues of Revolution that I saw, and remembering what was going on at the time in sort of the mid early 2000s, was futuristic watches were really all the rage. And you were amongst those people that were very supportive of it. You loved it. I loved it. And you did a really good job at sexing them up. I mean, probably be better than most. And then more recently, you seem to have a change of heart, whereas the sort of vintage style and stuff that was kind of getting popular became something that you focused on. Did you see a noticeable transfer of your taste? Do you still love everything? It's just been interesting to me watching you as a collector and your interest shift from that futurism and idealism and utopianism to sort of like, hey, the past was cool. And I'm just curious if that was a noticeable change within yourself.
I think that's an evolution as a human being as well, to kind of go on different journeys at different times. I think that there's what's that saying? That which the son seeks to forget, the grandson seeks to remember. So we've had a generational shift. And this generation seems to have embraced much smaller sizes, although I think we've all been talking about that way before brands even responded to it. Métier d'art, so everything that's related to something created by hand, cloisonné enamel to guilloché à main. And a lot of styling cues that comes from watches from like kind of this golden age of case making from like the 1930s and 40s or even the 50s, right? As to whether or not I'm still excited by modern watches, absolutely. And it's interesting too, because I've actually kind of been almost so overwhelmed by this neoclassic moment that I'm getting a little bit tired of it. Like, I'm getting a little bit tired of the next independent watchmaker that comes up with his spiritual three-hand watch. You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah.
That costs 90,000 Swiss francs, right? It's like, yep, I got a time-only watch, and if you turn it over, it's a relatively straightforward movement, It's slow beating. It's, it's...
Philippe Dufour said I would sell it.
Exactly. But don't worry, I did all the anglage and all these, 1 million inner angles. I only do them in the moonlight at a certain time of the night, because that's when it's most optimum. And, I'm like, all right, dude, whatever. Right. So I would actually say...
They read your articles. You told them people like that stuff.
Yeah. And I do. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like the key guys that make those watches the best, I still love, of course. Right. But then I also feel like that people can be very opportunistic. And when they see that working, then everyone wants to do it as well. Like, okay, I'll give you an example. I just recently saw a three-hand watch from an independent watchmaker that's 80,000 Swiss francs. That I was like, am I going to like this, or am I just going to be like, oh, another one? And I loved it. And then that was this Japanese watchmaker called Yotsuki Sekiguchi. I mean, it was absolutely astonishing. But he'd done something really extraordinary. He'd created a movement that was a tribute to Jules Jurgensen. He'd created this incredible regulator that was like read off of part of the bridge. It was cool. It was super, super cool. But in general, yeah, I feel that is a little bit overplayed at the moment. And I kind of feel as if modernity, or just the idea of creating a visual impact with a watch, right? Using the movement to tell a story or create a visual leitmotif that you're like sucked into. I think that's missing right now. As far as brands that were the entrenched players in contemporary watchmaking, what's their relevance today? A really good example is Hublot, right? Like, so Hublot has been the brand that everyone's been kind of like piling on, like in the last couple of years. And obviously there have been some key figures, or perhaps one key figure related to that. But for me, it's also interesting because Hublot kind of went down that road itself, right? I make this analogy where it's like a really good actor that made only superhero movies for the last 5 years, right? And everyone forgot that it's a really good actor. So if you look at the technical credibility of Hublot, right, with Matthias Boutet, who's the guy that's the technical wondermind there, and who's incidentally the guy that used to have a company with both Enrico Barbazzini and Michel Navas, who are also revered guys.
And their junior guy there was Rex Up?
Well, dude, okay, this is the thing. The Hublot tourbillon chronograph, right? If you look at that movement, it's exactly the same movement in the
they just ported it over.
AK01, right? So but one of them is finished in a certain way, and one of them is a little bit more modern. So there's incredible watchmaking value there as well. The other thing, too, is that people like to shit on the Unico. But I was like,
really?
Dude, a lot of times they're like, oh, it's just a clone of the 7750 or whatever. So then I was like, is it a clone of the 7750?
It's an awesome movement.
I went and met this guy named Christoph Leiter. I have his card right here. Let's see. Christoph Leiter, excuse me. And this guy was the guy who built the Unico. And I was so blown away by the technical authenticity of this watch. First of all, it's completely unlike a 7750. 7750 has a unidirectional winding system that wobbles.
They're not related at all. Right? They're like totally different.
This has had the initial ones had a Peloton winding system. Then it has a full clutch, not an oscillating pinion. And then it has a minute clutch. The second clutch is driven by the barrel. It's an incredible movement. And then the new version of this movement, which I think was released in 2019, I think.
A little bit smaller one?
Yeah. The slightly smaller one has also 2 rows of Liga teeth with flexible, 2 rows, of Liga gear wheels driving both clutches that have flexible teeth that eliminate chrono backlash and eliminate the need for a traditional spring jumper on the chronograph wheel. It's a freaking badass movement. It's so cool. It's just that, no one talked about it, right? So now I'm like, well, I guess it's my responsibility to talk about it because I'm kind of tired of people.
You remember the MP10 release and how underwhelming that was? Cool watch. Dude, it was like release.
Exactly, but I mean, again, it's this innovation that they kind of almost forgot that they have, right? And I think that now, hopefully, there's and so recently, I actually put on a 42mm ceramic Hublot. And I'm like, I freaking like this watch a lot, dude.
They've always been cool. I don't understand people.
I want to buy one, actually, So yes, the answer is I still love modern watches.
Okay. We're out of time. I'm going to ask you back at some point. Wei, tell people where they can learn more about you on the internet.
You can go to, I guess, my social media page, Wei Koh Revolution, or please come to revolutionwatch.com or to YouTube where you can see a Revolution Watch. And you know what? If I would normally just put up my WhatsApp on here and you guys could all just message me directly. But if you see me wander around any watch event, please feel completely free to come up to me and have a chat. I probably won't have a drink with you because, as you know, and Ariel and I are kind of avoiding that potentially for the rest of our lives. But I will certainly have a conversation with you because I love watch people. And thank you, Ariel.
Wei Koh, founder of Revolution Media and the Rake Magazine. Thank you so much for being on this episode of Superlative.
It's been a pleasure, sir. Thank you.